I would recommend for the Greenlanders to once and for all decide that they want to be part of the Western security architecture, and to stop being so ambiguous about getting Chinese investments in, and figuring out exactly how and who gets to make decisions when it comes to Chinese investments and the potential security implications, because that just remains a whole mess. And whenever China has an interest in Greenland, it creates a whole hullabaloo because no one knows who gets to make the decisions.
Hi, I'm Alex Dalziel, and this is Inside Policy Talks, the Macdonald-Laurier Institute's flagship podcast and videocast. I'm a senior fellow here at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, and we are paying a lot of attention these days to the Arctic. And the dominant headline in the Arctic, I would say, since December and so far in January, has certainly been Greenland at the top of the agenda. This has to do with U.S. President Donald Trump's remarks that it's absolutely necessary, I quote, for the United States to control Greenland, its pretensions to buy Greenland from Denmark, and the resulting responses we've seen, which include just this week, Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen traveling to Berlin and Paris and Brussels to rally support from EU partners, as well as an announcement of increased Danish defense spending involving Greenland and the Faroe Islands. And perhaps most importantly, we've had a consistent series of remarks from Greenlandic leadership, in particular Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen, about the fact that Greenland is not for sale. So in order to get around these headlines and dig a little bit deeper into this, I'm excited today because we have 4 experts coming from each of these 4 geographics. We have, I'm pleased to introduce Jon Rahbek-Clemmensen, who is the head of research at the Arctic Security Center of the Royal Danish Defence College in Copenhagen. We have Christian Keldsen, who's the president of the Greenland Business Association, located in Nuuk, Greenland. Coming from the United States, we have Marisol Maddox, who's a senior Arctic analyst at the Polar Institute of the Wilson Center. And finally, we have Dr. Jessica Shadian coming to us from Arctic 360, which is a think tank based in Toronto. So thanks, everyone. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
So let's start here. I think, we're going to try to get a couple of facts maybe from our Greenlandic and Danish friends to associate here, put in context for people exactly the relationship that exists currently between Greenland and Denmark, generally seen in this framework of the Kingdom of Denmark. Maybe it's not the usual way people think, but that's the official talk. So, Jon, let me just reach to you first on this to ask, what is the kind of constitutional arrangement that the Kingdom of Denmark has set up?
Yeah, so Greenland is a semi-autonomous part of the Kingdom of Denmark, together with Denmark proper and the Faroe Islands, and they have a fairly wide amount of autonomy. So the way the system is set up, Greenland has a palette of issues that they have gained control over. They then have a palette of issues that they can take over at some point if they want to. And then there are a few issues that they cannot take over, which is basically the core functions of the state: defense, currency, the justice system, stuff like that. However, even though foreign defense and security policy falls within the purview of the Danish government, de facto, Greenland and the Faroe Islands have informal influence over it. So the Danish government and prior Danish governments as well have stated that they won't make major defense decisions without consulting the two smaller parts of the kingdom, when those issues, of course, are related to those small parts of the kingdom.
And if I understand correctly there, Jon, just to come back to this, so the domestic responsibilities are primarily, if we're talking within Greenland, are administered from Nuuk, the capital, and then the foreign defense security policies, justice, as you mentioned, that's still coming from Copenhagen, but often in consultation.
Yeah, and then there are a wide array of what you call domestic issues that are still also currently controlled by Copenhagen, simply because the government in Greenland cannot afford to cover the costs associated with these issues themselves. But I mean, the Danish government has acknowledged the Greenlanders as a people under international law, and they have a right to become independent. The main reason why they do not want to seek independence as is right now is because Greenland cannot afford it, because the majority of parties in the Greenlandic parliament have independence as an ultimate goal. They just disagree about the speed with which they will achieve that goal. So it is a marriage of convenience, basically, as it is right now, kept together by the fact that Greenland cannot afford independence.
Christian, I'd like to come to you on this. I mean, you're in Greenland. I mentioned the Prime Minister of Greenland's remarks. I'd be curious a couple of things from you. One is your perspective in relation to this, particularly from the economic and business side, about how Greenland is oriented, and also the sense you're getting, from the business community in Greenland, from others you talk to, about the response to this initiative from the U.S. president.
Thank you very much, Alex. And I'd just like to say that the relationship within the Kingdom of Denmark, for Greenland's sake, has been ongoing for more than 1,000 years. So it's a very long relationship. And if we just take the past 300 years, I think it's very important to remember it's only moved in one direction, and that's towards more autonomy for Greenland. So we are a nation, sort of we are building. We're building a state, we're laying the tracks while the train is moving. That is the process. And I agree with what Jon just said, that all politicians agree that we want independence as the ultimate goal, but the discussion on the speed and how to get there is still ongoing, and it varies between the different parties. So we have a detachment party, and then all of the parties are in favor of independence and at least more autonomy within the Kingdom of Denmark, the so-called the rigsfællesskab. So I think that's very important to keep in mind. I don't necessarily see any objections to this from the Danish side, and I don't agree on the argument of this being whether Greenland can afford it or not, because basically this is about equality and respect within the Kingdom of Denmark. So obviously it's too rational to be talking about whether Greenland can afford it or not. So it's a very wealthy country, and if we were willing to do some big cuts and priorities, we would have lots of options. But it's all down to what kind of society and welfare system do we actually want to uphold going forward. In response to the business community here, we've been open to more trade with the surrounding world. We've been supporting the government in their endeavors to pursue more trade with North America as well. In 2019, I think it was, first time Trump announced he was interested in buying Greenland. He set up the consulate here. He allocated funds to various projects in Greenland. That's been ongoing through the Biden administration. So there's been sort of a straight line of interest in Greenland. And we've been tagging along, and we've been working very closely with the various governments and institutions on this. And that definitely continues. But I'd like to say, very important, it's very basic for business. In order for someone to buy something has to be for sale. We've got for sale on the shelves in terms of landmass.
Right. So maybe just as a final note on this, Christian, in terms of who Greenland, the structure of Greenlandic trade and the economy, is there anything you can point to there for our listeners about, who the primary partners are, what the primary products are, and maybe a little bit of insight on the mining side of things.
Definitely. And our main export definitely is within the fishing and the prawns. We've got about 98% of our exports would be fish and prawns. 50% of the market is in China. So China is a very important partner to us in that respect. The US is not something that's very big in the statistics, so we can hardly see that. So we're not at risk if say the tariffs or barriers were set up for Greenlandic companies. Then obviously we are trying to grow our tourism, and that's been growing definitely the last 40 years. We're seeing more and more activity, more and more investments, more and more tourists coming in. We've been seeing an increase in North American tourists, especially from the US, and that seems to scale up every time somebody wants to buy the country or gives us this kind of attention. And then you mentioned the mining, and definitely Greenland's had mines for more than 100 years. We were a very, very important partner for the US during the Second World War. And Greenland took over the responsibility for the underground in 2009. And since then, we've been growing our experience and our negotiations with the projects, with the investors, with the miners. And currently, we've got one, maybe two mines that are active, not necessarily turning a profit yet, but they are active. They're extracting and beginning export. And as a country and as the various projects, we've got 6 exploitation licenses that have been issued, and they're looking for financing for their projects. And I think that's the current biggest hurdle, is creating a safe environment for the investments, making sure these projects run along, and getting that aligned between our legislation and the requirements of the financial world, and obviously the off-takers. The off-takers could be European, they could be North American.
We'll come back to this a little bit later on in terms of some of the economic security questions. So thanks so much for that, Christian. So Marisol, I'm going to turn to you next. You know, we haven't seen the U.S. president backing down on this language. I mean, saying just in the last few days, you know, quote, I think we're going to have it, you know, and this insistence that, again, quote, we need Greenland for national security purposes. So I'm not asking you to tell me what's in the president's mind, but I would like you to tell me how you see U.S. interests when it comes to Greenland.
Yeah. You know, I think that there's really kind of a gap between the language that is coming out and the reality on the ground, because the U.S. has had such a great relationship, both with Denmark, the entire kingdom, you know, with Greenland. And so this is something that, you know, we're on such a great track to be kind of securing the interests that we do have in a way that's also conducive to respect, which I think is very important. But so basically, it's really, you know, certainly the security dimension of it. We've had Thule Air Base that is now Patuxent Space Base, which, you know, is based off of a 1951 permanent basing agreement. Of course, it was there before as well, but you know, that's really the agreement that allows us to have that permanent military presence. And then we have certain forums that meet regularly to be discussing that security cooperation and any concerns that we have, because we are living in a different world than 1951, but we're aware of that. And so, you know, it's just like the U.S. has talked about having a calibrated approach towards the Arctic because we're trying to pivot to the Indo-Pacific. It's very understandable that everybody's trying to calibrate investment and think about, what do I need to be, you know, kind of investing in. Of course, the economic dimension is also very important to the U.S. So looking at the mineral potential there, I think that President Trump is getting bad advice, because there's not a good reflection of the understanding of the barriers to speedy economic development of some of those resources in a way that makes any type of sense from a commercial standpoint. And so there seems to be a real gap there. But I would also say then that, you know, we've had this joint committee with the 4 pillars of cooperation to be advancing those interests. Of course, Greenland is a part of the Mineral Security Partnership. So that is advancing in a way that's positive, but the U.S. only benefits from being a partner of choice, not by using disrespectful language. And then just the third dimension, I would say, is the maritime route potential. And that's something that we've seen, obviously, from Greenland in their new strategy that they issued, that they are interested in developing the maritime transit. And so I think there's a lot of potential there. But again, there seems to be kind of I think from the U.S. government perspective right now, a misunderstanding of some of the barriers to greater shipping, because as people know who understand these routes, there's a high level of uncertainty and risk, especially in that part between Canada and Greenland, where we have ice chunks breaking off from Greenland that are actually creating more hazards in the water. This isn't something that's just blue water, easy sailing. But so those are the kind of three different buckets. But obviously, I'm caveating it just to show that it's complex.
Mm-hmm. And there's deep roots. I mean, I think certainly the change of the name of Thule to Pacific Space Base does reflect some of the evolving security dynamics in the North American Arctic. Jessica, I want to come to you next because, Canada is not getting talked about a lot in this. It's very much a conversation about transatlantic being U.S. with mostly the Kingdom of Denmark and Greenland, but also the EU, NATO. What are the implications? So, but I mean, Greenland is Canada's neighbor. We have a land border actually now. Some people may know this, on a small island in the straits between Canada and Greenland, where we share a land border, the world's longest maritime boundary, and various other ties. I counted something like 21 references in Canada's new Arctic foreign policy document that came out in December to Greenland. I can't compare that to the past, but it's quite a few references, plans to open a consulate. So I'd really like to hear from you what you think the Canadian interest or set of interests is or are in this question.
Yeah. So I would say Canada's interests regarding Greenland are first and foremost geographical, like you just mentioned, and cultural. And increasingly, they're also diplomatic and they're economic. We also know, Greenlanders, like Canadians, but Greenlanders want more Canada. Just this past December, there was a poll that found that 80% of Greenlanders actually want more cooperation with Canada. In terms of business and economic cooperation, one example is the intent to cooperate between Canadian North and Air Greenland. There's now a direct route that we've seen just opening between Iqaluit and Nuuk. In terms of political cooperation, we have an MOU between Nunavut and Greenland, but there's also the Danish, Greenlandic, and Canadian intent to cooperate on joint management of the waters that are in between Greenland and Canada. Greenland, as you mentioned, Greenland is committed to open a representation in Ottawa because right now it's currently located in Washington, D.C., representing both the United States and Canada. And at the same time, in its new Arctic, Canada's new Arctic foreign policy, it calls for also opening up our own representation in Nuuk. But Canada's North and Greenland, they both, hold vast amounts of critical minerals, as Christian was talking about. And, this also has enormous economic and national security potential. But I'd also say that potential can also be then a big sense of or source of insecurity, and that's for both Greenland and Canada. And I would say that that's not independent of one another. And I think the most obvious example is basically the focus of our conversation today, because what separates, the U.S. state of Alaska and Greenland, it's the Northwest Passage, which Canada argues to be its internal waters, and what the United States has explicitly said during Trump's first administration is an illegal claim because it's an international strait. And so I think we should add to that fact, that the Canadian North it's underdeveloped, it's underdefended. And so frankly, really, Canada has no ability to thwart the United States or any other nation from transiting the Northwest Passage. And so given this, and the fact that, probably U.S. sentiments are not going to bend in our favor, I would say that strengthening cooperation with Greenland is very much in Canada's interest. And then I'll just kind of say one last thing, because we could talk about it later and leave it there. But I feel like it opens the door a bit to a discussion as to then, on these security issues about whether Greenland might wish or be welcome to join maybe NORAD. And so in areas like this, maybe this is where Canada could be in a well positioned maybe to invite some of these types of discussions.
Well, there's lots to pull apart, I think, in what everyone has said here so far. Maybe I'll just make a very quick reference. I mean, we all say Greenland, but it's Kalaallit Nunaat is the official name as well of Greenland, which does point to this cultural tie between Inuit Nunaats, the homeland of the Inuit people of North America, and Canadians populations in Nunavut, etc. So there are these cross strait sort of connections. I'd like to, you've each raised something, and I think you've hit a lot of the buckets, as Marisol put it, on things. I'd like to do just a bit of a quick speed round here to ask each one of you maybe 30 seconds each to tell me, what are the new or evolving threats? I think this is one of the big challenges we're having as people who follow the Arctic. Security is clearly changing. I mean, we see the different events going on in the Arctic that involve competition between, the United States and Russia, the United States and China, the Nordic countries and their repositioning, Canada's new orientation and its defense planning for more Arctic orientation. But teasing out exactly what those threats are is not always easy. So I'd like to maybe go around and just get a sense, from a kind of North American Arctic perspective, perspectives of the 4 areas we have here. What are kind of the new threats that we have to worry about and address? Maybe I'll go in reverse order here from that. So I'll start with Jess.
Oh, sure. In terms of like economic, let's say, I only sort of see this as a potential opportunity for Canada, because as more attention is paid to the region, to the North American Arctic region in particular, it kind of is it's pushing Canada to actually have to move and do things. And if anything that we do is to the economic benefit, I think, of Canada, because it entails investments and especially infrastructure could certainly be dual use. On the diplomatic,
that mean that not moving is the threat or the risk.
Yes, I think that exactly.
Not on the opportunity.
Inaction is the biggest threat, right? And then diplomatic, we're in a sticky position. The United States or Canada doesn't have the opportunity to decide what and how it will, or if it wants to cooperate with the United States. So that is something that's going to continue and has to, and will be strengthened and grow. And, how that comes about, we'll see. And then at the same time, though, I think it's, Canada's relationship with Greenland. I could see diplomatic relations. It's in Canada's interest to strengthen those. And I don't think that that's the detriment or a threat to the United States, in fact, right? So we should do both at the same time, and we should. And so it's seemingly like a benefit. And so I think we're going to see greater concentration of a North American Arctic, probably.
So inaction from Canada would be threat number 1. Marisol, I'll go to you next.
Okay, I'm going to try to sum this up quickly because there's a lot of changes. Obviously, like space is now a domain, right? So we have the 821st Space-Based Group that is based at Patuxent. That's really important for a lot of things, but including force projection. Right. And the U.S. is obviously trying to pivot towards the Indo-Pacific. That's where you see with like the strategic competition with China that takes many different forms. And one of those is with the larger global economic shift towards decarbonization, the interest in securing minerals necessary for that to occur. And not just for energy, but also for, all sorts of things that are very important that require minerals. And so we've seen that China and Russia, especially China, who obviously dominates the minerals, both all aspects of the supply chain and the processing. But they and Russia have been, taking efforts around the world to build diplomatic relationships and physical presence and influence in areas where they could be sourcing more minerals and denying Europe and North America from securing that for ourselves, right?
Yeah,
and so that's a piece
economic
of
security and space-related issues as kind of the key themes you're raising.
Yeah, and then I guess also just reflected in the U.S. updated DoD Arctic strategy from 2024, one of the very significant changes from the 2019 strategy was the level of cooperation, alignment, and physical presence of Russia and China together in the Arctic. But of course, we've also seen things like the formal cooperation between the Danish-led Joint Arctic Command out of Greenland with NATO's Maritime Command to be, providing that maritime situational awareness to Supreme Allied Commander Europe. So, I mean, again, there are new things that are changing, but we've had progress to be reflecting that new reality. So I just want to be emphasizing that we are on the good track, and disrupting it is actually, I would say, the biggest threat that we're facing now. Is the U.S. not a reliable security partner? And in fact, would the U.S. potentially do something aggressive physically or economically? To even have to consider that is immensely harmful and disruptive to the progress that we need within the timelines that we need it.
Christian, I'll come to you for the, for the perspective from Nuke.
Yeah, it's the perspective from Nuke, but it's also from the business community. I'd say a certain risk is the Kingdom of Denmark or the current alliance is imploding on us in this current situation, leaving Greenland adrift, floating in the water, because nobody's interested in having this country lying without any real alliances. That's definitely something, because then you're going to be up for grabs from all sorts of jurisdictions, and I think that would be a definite threat to Greenland. But a lot of surrounding countries, and the US in particular, would not be too interested in some of the countries that might be interested in Greenland. But I think also a risk for the business community here is if this situation goes on for too long, sort of a prolonged uncertainty of the alliances and the loyalty of Greenland. It does nothing good for the investment environment. We need that security. We need that reliability that we belong to these jurisdictions, these alliances. That's what you're investing into. And then, and on a final note, from the business perspective, the green transition seems to be a big thing in the world at the moment. But as of last week, that's sort of been downscaled from the US side. That could mean something for the offtake of the minerals that we have in our country, and the role we see ourselves in playing in terms of getting the green transition off its feet. So that's also a threat that we're losing out on some opportunities.
Jon, I'll come to you for the defense perspective from Denmark.
Yeah. So and I completely agree with Marisol's point that actually right now the biggest risk is where the US is going to orient itself, and that uncertainty that follows from that. Because if you look at Greenland in military terms, Greenland is probably one of the few places remaining in the Arctic that you could actually call a low tensions area, because at least until Donald Trump returned to the White House. Because for Russia, Greenland is mainly thought to be within the American sphere of interest. The conventional threat from Russia against Greenland is rather small. Of course, there's a hybrid threat, but I wouldn't argue that would be significantly larger than any other place in the Arctic. And at the same time, China hasn't really shown an interest in Greenland since 2019. So I wouldn't say that, at least in the short term, that China is a threat, although in the more medium term, you could see Chinese interest returning. So as I began by saying, I mean, it's all about Donald Trump. What's going to happen in the months and years to come? Can we go back to the actually rather well functioning relationship we had until December this year, or how long will this period of uncertainty continue?
Right. So maybe I'll pursue a bit, Jon, on that question. As I mentioned at the beginning, Denmark has made some significant investments in defense and security, really starting in December, I believe, with the first announcement of a excess of $1 billion US. Now another $2 billion investment with a heavy focus on Greenland. Can you maybe pull that apart a bit? What's where the money is going, and how that relates to strengthening some of these new dynamics, response to these new dynamics.
Yeah, so it's important to keep in mind that these investments aren't completely due to Donald Trump. These are conversations that's been ongoing for a long time prior to the U.S. election result, and so Denmark is currently going to invest in 3 new ships, patrol vessels, to replace its old Thetis class vessels. It's also going to invest in additional drones, mainly or probably for surface domain awareness in the Arctic, and it's also going to invest more in satellite capacities. So right now, the name of the game is domain awareness, and it's about replacing some of the older capacities that Denmark has, and investing in new types of capacities such as drones. However, we still have yet to see exactly what types of equipment we're talking about. So just saying a ship doesn't tell you that much about what the ship's going to do. So in the months and years to come, we'll see whether these ships will be anti-submarine warfare capacities, or whether they will be mainly used for, I guess, more traditional Coast Guard tasks, which is something that the Danish government also covers in Greenland. And the same goes for the drones. It remains to be seen exactly how potent these capabilities are going to be, because we don't know exactly what type they're going to buy.
I think it's an important point here that there's a process that the Kingdom of Denmark goes through for defense spending. I mean, each country has its own process. I believe this is part 2 of the, how do you put it, defense agreement, or yes.
Yeah, part
3 coming, I believe, later this year.
Yes. And one thing to keep in mind is that the Danish government has also announced that they're going to have an additional Arctic package probably before the summer, but that they want to complete the discussions about NATO's new capability targets before they announce what capabilities they're going to buy, which kind of makes sense, right? Why would you buy something that the alliance doesn't demand?
Excellent. Thank you for that. Maybe I'll come here again to Marisol and Jessica about this. Jessica, you mentioned in passing there about NORAD, and I'm curious about, thinking a little more about how Greenland's been conceived, and again, are institutions like NORAD currently up to the task of thinking about these challenges you've mentioned, and if not, where you might make adjustments? Maybe I'll start with Marisol and then go to Jessica.
This is something where I actually think there's so much potential, and there's a lot of really interesting and productive movement in the right direction right now. So, of course, the Greenland ice sheet is like a mile high, and so there are concerns about some of the places where we have kind of radar blind spots, and so that's where Denmark's investments into infrastructure on the eastern side of Greenland is really helpful, as well as, of course, the radar installations on the Faroe Islands, right? This is kind of, you have to take the whole kind of theater perspective here. And so I think, there had been some conversations about maybe a role for Greenland in NORAD. But, of course, the major concerns I had heard from Greenlanders was really this concern about kind of militarization and just wanting to really balance the security role to not, to be sensitive to the fact that it is Greenland's culturally and the amount of population, all of that, to be kind of balancing, the way that we engage Greenland in a way that really is mutually beneficial. But I think that there's a lot of potential there. And I've even, heard some ideas about doing more air surveillance patrols off the eastern side of Greenland. And so I think, there's a lot of opportunity there for U.S., Canadian, Greenlandic, Danish cooperation.
Right. And Jessica?
Yeah, I think we're kind of maybe at an inflection point. There's always this idea about this North American Arctic, but I feel like now we're getting to a point is trying to understand what that is and what that means. And I think there is definitely a defense component to that. So as we were talking about, we already spoke about NORAD and whether or not there's, because, Canada's bookends are both the United States and Greenland. And so whether that's something for potential, I also, thinking, Marisol, about what you were saying in terms of the, being sensitive to having over militarization of things. But from a Canadian perspective, I also think like investments towards strengthening NORAD also include a lot of upgrades in terms of infrastructure. And so that's, energy, telecommunications, and physical, just like, maritime ports, roads, air. And so there's also that kind of aspect to it. And so I think we could be thinking more of in a multi-purpose, also orientation about how that can also facilitate other ways for collaboration. But, kind of this then also then connects us to this whole bigger piece that that was being discussed about, because NATO, and how it relates to NORAD and how it relates to NATO. And so then you kind of get into that whole piece. And so where the United States might be focusing its orientations going forward in its relationship to NATO. I do think that we're at a point right now where, like you were saying, I think too, inaction is not an option for Canada, or we're just going to be, pushed into whatever else is everyone else's interests. And I don't think that's in the interest of Canada. So.
Mm-hmm. Maybe I should just mention for listeners, I think most Canadian and U.S. listeners would know NORAD, but I mean, for maybe a broader set of listeners, NORAD is the binational. It's, Canada and the U.S., U.S. led, but with a Canadian kind of second in command for mostly aerospace defense in North America, coming from Cold War times, and against, at that time, Soviet threats. So it's a very important institution to North American defense. And, thinking about some of the new threats we're facing from Russia, from others in terms of higher advanced weapon systems, there's been some discussion there. So you've made a couple points there about infrastructure. And again, the sort of, I think in Marisol's remarks, kind of what Greenlanders want. And I do think that is kind of one of the pivot points in this, that's, in this whole discussion. Greenland last year put out a foreign policy kind of Arctic strategy. And again, going back to what Jon said, this is kind of framed within the Kingdom of Denmark, but for trade, for business, for cultural people-to-people contacts, the North America emphasis in that document was quite strong. So Christian, I might come back to you on this in terms of, I think you've talked about it a bit before, but if you had to have specific things that, from the business community perspective, that Greenland is looking for from North America, and maybe not just the United States, what is at the top of your list for that?
I think one repeat more what's on the top of the list for the government, because I think the whole Russia-Ukraine situation sort of emphasized the need to diversify not just your economy, but your supply lines as well. And we are very dependent on a single line going into Europe via Denmark, and with Europe being the gateway to our main market in China.
Can I just jump in on that quickly, Christian? Because when I visited Nuuk last year and had the chance to talk with you and others, it is very striking, I think, for North Americans to understand that those supply lines are still very much across the North Atlantic to Europe, that in fact, the amount of goods, et cetera, coming in from North America it's very, very small.
Yeah, but you have to remember that we're a population of 56,000 people. 20,000 of those people live within regions where their demand is defined by law, what products they get into these regions. And then you've got about 30,000 plus people that have some free will over what supplies they want to buy. And I'm not too familiar with North American economy, but I would guess 30,000 people, that's what passes through an average mall in a suburb to New York on a Monday morning between 10 and noon. So from a market perspective, Greenland is very small. And that means that everything coming in here needs to be consolidated. So all our shipments here are consolidated. We don't have very many containers coming in with just one type of goods. It'll be mixed between 10 different types of products and goods coming in. That's how we can keep the continuance in our supply to Greenland. So there is a drive from the government to look more to North America for trade routes, but it's not necessarily broad across the whole government. It's anchored with a few individuals. And obviously, from our perspective, business community, we are open to business. We are open to exploring what's relevant. We are getting lots and lots and lots of North American products in, but they're coming in through the European agencies. We have some of our retailers and wholesalers looking into more options with North America. But it is difficult shifting the cultural needs, because some of the products we have here are in demand. If you replace the Danish butter with the North American equivalent, that's going to create some ripples and so on and so on. We see this with Iceland. They've been trying since the late 40s to change to North America, but they're still very much European bound when it comes to supplies. So that was the one thing, looking for more supply lines to go in and out of Greenland. And in terms of the export, there was a strong political drive also to go more towards North America. The problem being that we get a better yield of it. There's more revenue to be picked up in other markets than the North American market, from our perspective.
Right. Jon, I'll come to you next on that. Again, you described some of the defense investments, etc. What do you think, if you're imagining, the defense minister, the Danish foreign minister, prime minister talking to their counterparts in the United States and in Canada, what are they looking for on the security and defense side?
Well, I think to a large extent, they would actually be looking for a clearer idea about how Greenland fits within North American defense and how it can be related to NORAD in particular. Because when you move in defense circles in Copenhagen, at least that's my impression, NORAD does not take up that much space, which is curious. For the reasons that Jessica and Marisol mentioned for a while ago. I mean, Greenland, for instance, the aerial domain awareness over Greenland is virtually zero. So basically, Russian long-range bombers can fly over Greenland without being discovered right now. And I would imagine that that's part of how you think about North American defense, but it just doesn't take up that much space in the Danish conversation. And it's my impression that it doesn't take up that much space from the US and Canada either. So that's one place where one could think about if there's any sort of synergy that can be developed between Canada, the US, and Denmark. And then specifically about Canada, I think actually a lot of the potential could be in, I guess, what you would call more of the Coast Guard side of things. So there's already a lot of cooperation between the Joint Arctic Command in Greenland and its Canadian counterparts. But it's also my impression that down on the very, very tactical level, that perhaps even more could be done. I don't have any specific places I can point a finger to, but it's my impression that that's actually where Canadian, Danish, Greenlandic collaboration works best. And one thing I would also highlight is that in this new defense package, they announced that Denmark is going to move and Greenland are going to move towards building what's called Greenlandic ranges, and modeled specifically on the Canadian ranges. And I think that's a place where Denmark and Greenland could learn from Canada in particular, and where perhaps even you could imagine some sort of collaboration with some of the other Nordic countries to learn from the Canadian experiences with integrating local and indigenous peoples in the activities of the defense forces. because I think it's a place where Canada has been a front runner, and where the other countries can learn a lot.
Jessica, I don't know, are you able to give a 20-second description of what the Rangers are for our listeners? If not, I can try.
Yeah, I mean, they're exactly what, Jon said. They're local, they're indigenous, in our north, and they basically they're considered the eyes and ears, right, of protecting our Arctic sovereignty, and so they do play a strong role. I think there's a lot of more potential actually for Inuit and other Northerners to be part of the larger defense infrastructure, but they do play an important role. That can't be the only role of our foreign policy or our defense policy, but
Right.
But I think that's an interesting idea. So
all pieces of the puzzle. Yeah. I mean, we haven't said, but North-North cooperation, I know, is something that Greenland has talked about. And Jessica, you referred to it, the cultural connections, et cetera. So some different institutions we have in the particular context of the Arctic are probably something that can be shared across all the like-minded democratic Arctic NATO countries. We're coming to the end here. Again, I think we've touched on it here a little bit already, but I'll give each of you about a 30-second chance. And what I'm looking for here is a kind of, if you had the chance to, speak to your respective leaders and say, this is the agenda item we need to strengthen cooperation, if you can give, again, that top of the wish list sort of thing, but what would be that, kind of, again, you got 30 seconds, but pitch for what really needs to happen to strengthen North American Arctic security with the Greenland perspective baked in. Marisol, I'll start with you.
I would recommend that President Trump get advisors on the Arctic who actually understand the Arctic, and to understand that we have fantastic mechanisms and forums in place to be advancing and securing our interests and addressing U.S. concerns, and that really, if you kind of go back to this old school idea about spheres of influence and validating that way of thinking, I find the argument that actually then encourages China to take Taiwan to be pretty compelling. And I think that it would behoove us to not be validating those types of approaches, but instead to be looking at all that we have to gain from working off of the fantastic foundation that we have, and how important it is to not have any kind of misperception of how valuable that is until you lose it, and then you realize, oh wow, that actually worked out pretty well for us.
So I'm hearing Arctic expertise and knowledge at the top level of government, with maybe an eye to the broader unintended consequences, perhaps, of geopolitical. Christian, I'll go to you next.
Well, I'm married to the Canadian consul here in Greenland, so I'm just going to go home and be nice to her. I think that'll open up everything. Nah, that aside.
Best diplomacy ever.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah. No, that aside, Greenland has been signing MOUs, as Jessica mentioned before. We've got one with Nunavut, we've got one with the US, we've got Iceland and so on. And these have all been signed recently. And I think it's time now to be building on those MOUs, because they are nothing more than MOUs that need to come into to existence as agreements. And currently, we know that the foreign policy and the defense security is with Denmark, but I feel that Greenland has the ear of Denmark at the moment. We're seeing a lot of support from the Danish side. So I'd like to see Greenland pursue all these options with our neighboring countries, and that's very well aligned with what our government is currently talking about.
So getting agreements into action and implementing. Great point.
Implementing, getting more solid, getting more concrete on what are we going to do with these agreements, and have that very, very well sounded with our business community. We'd like to see the business community driving this, rather than having a government going out and saying, these are the countries we want to talk to. Now you have to tag along and find whatever you can find and pick up along the way. We need this to be business driven as well.
Okay, great. Thanks, Christian. Jon, to come to you, you have 30 seconds with Prime Minister Frederiksen. What do you say?
Well, I mean, first of all, I would completely agree with Marisol that I mean, if you look at Greenland from a cynical American point of view, the current situation is the best of both of is the best situation for the U.S., right? They get to have their cake and eat it too. They get all their interests in Greenland, and they don't have to pay for it. The Danes basically pay for Greenland. So actually, taking over Greenland wouldn't help the U.S. get its interests, but it would just give them the bill, which to me sounds like a bad deal, and that doesn't sound like something Donald Trump would like to have. In terms of what
Jon is aiming high. He wants the audience with the U.S. president himself to deliver
exactly. Well, I mean, he will soon.
Save money, leave Greenland alone. Yeah.
But I think one place where you could actually do something would be to think a little bit long term in terms of a potential Chinese interest in Greenland again. So there are a couple of gaps in when it comes to potential Chinese investments in Greenland. And if I were in Washington, I would actually look at that and see and think, okay, this is actually a potential problem that we need to solve. So I would recommend getting an investment screening law passed in Greenland. I would recommend for the Greenlanders to once and for all decide that they want to be part of the Western security architecture, and to stop being so ambiguous about getting Chinese investments in, and figuring out exactly how and who gets to make decisions when it comes to Chinese investments and the potential security implications, because that just remains a whole mess. And whenever China has an interest in Greenland, it creates a whole hullabaloo because no one knows who gets to make the decisions.
Great. So strengthen some of the governmental policy and regulation and potentially collective thinking about meeting the challenge of China. Jessica, last word is going to you. If you were Prime Minister Trudeau or whoever may replace him in the short term, what would you say?
Well, out the gate, inaction is not an option. We have a new president of the United States talking about manifest destiny. We should take it seriously. And it's interesting picking up on Jon in terms of inaction is not an option. I would say we need to build our infrastructure. We need to, because to say that we don't want nefarious investments in our country, in our north, is one thing, but you have to do something then. At the same time, I would say that we need to move quickly. This representation in Nuuk, whoever is then, going to be the new government, this is something we should pick up on right away. And I think that also Canada has could play an important role in trying to navigate discussions about North American Arctic defense and security, because we can either try to take a lead and help kind of diplomatically, and help facilitate those discussions, or we're just going to be sandwiched out and be kind of on the receiving end of what's to come. So
infrastructure,
we have a lot of opportunity, potential. Yeah, it's just we also need to act, stand up.
Yeah. Act, infrastructure, investment, and I always like finishing on a note like this: Canadian leadership, which I think in the Arctic is something Canada can do much more than it currently is. I want to thank all four of you for joining me today and our listeners: Christian, Marisol, Jon, Jessica. This has been a great discussion. I hope we can do it again. This issue isn't going to go away. I think you've given a sense of the important ongoing issues, whatever the kind of political overlay is, that we need to be paying attention to, and thinking a little more about Greenland as part of the North American picture and how that relates to its connections to Europe and the North Atlantic and other spaces. Thank you all so much. To our listeners, thanks for joining. For Inside Policy Talks, I'm Alex Dalziel. See you again.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Alex.
Thank you.